You know what's strange about the conversation around the war in Ukraine? Everyone keeps asking the same question. Can Russia win? Should Russia win? Will Russia win? But here's what almost no one is discussing. What if Russia doesn't need to win at all? What if the entire framework we're using to understand this conflict is built on an assumption that stopped being relevant months ago? Because when you look at Russia's strategic position today, something curious emerges. The country is under the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. Its economy was supposed to collapse within weeks. Its military was expected to fragment. Its political system was predicted to implode. And yet none of that happened. Not because Russia is winning, but because Russia has discovered something far more valuable than victory. It's discovered how to make the cost of its defeat unbearable for everyone else. So what does that actually mean? How does a country that's supposed to be losing actually reshape the entire strategic landscape? How do you change the rules of a game you're not even winning? To understand this, we need to go back to a moment most people have forgotten. Before February 2022, there was a very clear model for how modern conflicts were supposed to work. You had overwhelming force, you had international coalition building, you had economic leverage, and you had a defined endpoint, victory or defeat. This model had been tested and refined over decades. The Gulf War, the Balkans, Afghanistan, at least initially, Libya. The framework was clear. If you had enough military power, enough economic weight, and enough international support, you could shape outcomes. The game had rules. Everyone understood them. But something fundamental changed when Russia invaded Ukraine. Not in the invasion itself, but in what happened after. Because the West deployed every tool it had developed over the past 30 years. Comprehensive sanctions, asset freezes, technology export controls, financial system exclusions, military aid packages, intelligence sharing, diplomatic isolation. It was the most coordinated, most comprehensive response to aggression since World War II. And here's what matters. It didn't produce the expected result. This created a loop that no one had planned for. The sanctions were supposed to create economic collapse. Economic collapse was supposed to create political pressure. Political pressure was supposed to force strategic retreat. But each step in that chain broke down. The sanctions created pressure, yes, but they also created adaptation. Russia found new buyers for its energy. It developed alternative payment systems. It reorganized supply chains. It discovered that economic pain, when properly managed and distributed, doesn't necessarily translate into political change. More importantly, it discovered that the pain was bilateral. Europe needed Russian energy more urgently than Russia needed European markets. China and India were willing to step into the gap, not out of ideological alignment, but out of pure economic logic. Now let's talk about scale, because this is where the numbers become hard to ignore. Before the war, Russia exported roughly 7.5 million barrels of oil per day. The West expected those exports to collapse. They didn't. They rerouted. Russia now sells much of that oil to India and China at discounted prices, but it still sells it. The revenue stream didn't disappear, it just changed direction. Meanwhile, Europe spent over $800 billion on energy imports in 2022, much of it replacing Russian supplies at premium prices. The German economy, the engine of European industry, contracted. Energy-intensive industries across the continent shut down or relocated. The economic pain was real, but it wasn't unilateral. And here's where it gets more complex. Russia's military spending increased to roughly 6% of GDP. That's enormous by modern standards, but it's sustainable for a resource-exporting economy with low debt levels and currency controls. The Russian defense industry adapted faster than anyone predicted. Sanctions on semiconductors, Russia sourced them through third countries. Sanctions on industrial components, domestic production increased, and substitutes were found. The military machine didn't collapse, it slowed, it adapted, it became less efficient, but it didn't stop. But something changed around mid-2023, and this is the inflection point most analysts missed. It wasn't a battlefield breakthrough. It wasn't a diplomatic victory. It was something more subtle, a realization that spread through Western capitals without anyone explicitly stating it. The realization was this: Russia cannot be forced to lose faster than the West can sustain the effort to make it lose. Read that again because it's the core of everything that followed. Why now? Because the costs started compounding in ways that weren't predicted. Military aid to Ukraine exceeded $100 billion from Western sources. That's not just money, it's weapons stocks depleted, production capacity stretched, defense budgets strained. European energy prices created inflation that central banks couldn't easily control. Political consensus started fragmenting, not because of Russian propaganda, but because domestic populations were absorbing real economic costs with no clear endpoint in sight. And then there's Ukraine itself, a country fighting heroically but gradually exhausting its mobilization capacity, its infrastructure, its economic base. Now watch how these forces connect, because this is where system thinking becomes essential. Economic pressure on Europe creates political pressure. Political pressure creates hesitation about long-term commitments. Hesitation creates uncertainty about aid sustainability. Uncertainty affects Ukrainian morale and strategic planning. All of this creates leverage for Russia, not because Russia is winning militarily, but because time is becoming Russia's ally. The longer the conflict continues, the more the economic pain spreads, the more political coalitions fragment, the more war fatigue sets in. And here's the deeper structure. This isn't just about Ukraine. Russia recognized something that reshapes great power competition itself. It recognized that in an interconnected global economy, there is no such thing as truly unilateral costs. Every sanction creates a counter pressure. Every weapon shipment depletes stockpiles needed elsewhere. Every political commitment made today constrains flexibility tomorrow. Russia didn't need to win. It just needed to ensure that its defeat would be more costly than the West was willing to bear. These aren't separate problems. They interact. The energy crisis affects defense budgets. Defense spending affects inflation. Inflation affects political support. Political support affects aid commitments. Aid commitments affect Ukrainian capabilities. Ukrainian capabilities affect Russian strategy. It's a web, not a chain. And Russia positioned itself at multiple nodes of that web, not through brilliant strategy necessarily, but through a combination of geographic advantage, resource wealth, and a political system that can absorb domestic costs more easily than democratic societies can. Now consider two scenarios, both plausible. In the optimistic frame, Western support continues, Ukraine stabilizes its defensive lines, Russia eventually recognizes that further escalation is futile, and some negotiated settlement emerges that preserves Ukrainian sovereignty while acknowledging geopolitical realities. The international system adapts, sanctions become normalized, and Europe successfully transitions away from Russian energy dependence. But there's a darker possibility. The conflict becomes frozen, not through formal agreement, but through mutual exhaustion. Russia holds territory it currently occupies. Ukraine lacks the capacity to reclaim it. Western aid continues, but at reduced levels as political will erodes. The sanctions remain, but lose their bite as global trade patterns permanently adjust. And here's what matters. Russia accepts this outcome not as defeat, but as success. Because it demonstrated something unprecedented in the post-Cold War era, that a regional power can challenge the existing international order, absorb the consequences, and fundamentally alter the strategic calculus of great power competition. These aren't separate stories about a regional conflict and economic warfare and energy politics. They're the same story, a story about the limits of economic coercion, the resilience of authoritarian systems, and the hidden fragility of international coalitions when costs become unbearable. Russia didn't need to win the war in Ukraine. It just needed to prove that the West couldn't force it to lose without paying a price that democratic societies might not be willing to pay indefinitely. That should concern all of us. Because if Russia succeeds in establishing this model, that survival equals success, that absorbing pain creates leverage, that time favors those who can endure, it doesn't just change the outcome in Ukraine, it changes the rules for every future conflict where a determined regional power confronts an international order built on economic interdependence and coalition warfare. The game itself has changed, and we're only beginning to understand what that means.